"You're no real soldier, Kara." My brother said that with a careless laugh, lifting his beer as if he were delivering a joke everyone was waiting for. Around the Thanksgiving table in my mother's small home on the outskirts of Akron, Ohio, the chatter paused just long enough for the insult to land. Then the room stirred again with soft chuckles and little nods, the kind of quiet agreement that slices deeper than anything loud. The house smelled like roasted turkey, cinnamon, nutmeg, and the faint cold drifting in from the drafty kitchen window. But all I could feel was the sting of being reduced to nothing in front of people who shared my blood. I forced a smile because that was the position I had learned. Growing up, keep the peace, soften the edges, take the hit. Blake leaned back in his chair, proud of himself, 31 years old and still performing for an audience. "Kara is just a medic. Not real combat," he repeated, as if the first blow had not been enough. I heard someone near the end of the table whisper something about me being small, that I never looked strong enough to do anything dangerous anyway. Another voice piped up, the playful kind that pretends to be innocent while aiming dead center. "I mean, look at her tiny. How could she fight anyone?" My mother did not lift her gaze from her plate. My stepmother gave a polite smile to the relatives she was trying to impress. I sat there swallowing the cold heaviness building inside my chest. My brother was not done. "You don't have to keep pretending you served. No one here is impressed." The sentence sat in the air like smoke, sharp and lingering. I felt the familiar weight of humiliation pressing against my ribs. It was not the first time he had said things like that, but this time it cut differently, because he said it in front of every cousin, aunt, uncle in the room. I steadied my breath. I did my job. My voice was calm, almost too calm, and that made a few people smirk like I had just proven their point. The conversation turned back to football, to fantasy leagues, to everything that seemed more worthy of attention than my service. I sat still, shoulders squared, eyes steady, pretending the words did not crush against old bruises. No one at the table knew the truth. No one there cared to know. They saw the surface version of me, the quiet daughter who had left home at 18, the one who never raised her voice, the girl who was easy to overlook. They had no idea who they were speaking to. Inside me, a different story lived, a different identity carved into bone and memory. Staff Sergeant Kara Hale, United States Army, MOS, 68W Combat Medic, attached to the 75th Ranger Regiment for 2 deployments, recipient of the Purple Heart and the Silver Star. The soldier they called the Angel of Kunar because I had pulled an entire squad out of a kill zone in the mountains of Afghanistan in 2019. The medic who had crawled through debris and dust and chaos while rounds cracked overhead, who had kept pressure on a severed artery while ordering a radio for a 9-line, who had refused extraction until every wounded man was lifted onto the helicopter before me. They did not know about the ceremony where an entire formation stood and applauded when the commander pinned the medal onto my uniform. They did not know about the article in Army Times or the Veterans Day speech, where I stood behind a podium, trembling not from fear, but from the weight of remembering the friends I had lost. They did not know about the nightmares, the rehab, the months in the VA hospital, learning again how to lift my left arm without pain. They never asked and never wanted to listen. They dismissed my service because acknowledging it would have forced them to rethink their roles in my life roles, where they were always superior, always right, always the ones I should look up to. I kept my expression smooth the way I had learned to do under stress. My fingers slipped into the pocket of my jacket draped over the back of my chair, touching the edge of the small wooden box I always carried during the holidays. Inside it lay the Purple Heart, the medal I received after shrapnel tore into my shoulder during the Kunar ambush. I brought it not to show off, but to remind myself that the silence around me did not erase what I had survived. I looked around the table at people who believed they knew me, and I thought if they ever knew who they were talking to, they would not laugh this loud. So I breathed in slow and steady, held the hurt in place, and let the betrayal settle into something colder, something sharper, something I could use. If anyone has ever laughed at your pain or erased your sacrifice, stay with me. You are not alone. I grew up being told what I was and what I was not, shaped by a house where my brother Blake shone without effort, while I learned early that my place was somewhere behind him. Quieter, smaller, expected to endure what he never had to face. And by the time I reached 17, I already understood that no matter what I did, I would be measured against a standard built for him, never for me. At 27, I stand average in height, with a frame that never impressed anyone at first glance. I am not the kind of person people look at and immediately think soldier, let alone someone who has crawled through dust and fire and walked out carrying men twice my size. But back then, when I was still a teenager in Akron, all they saw was a daughter they considered stubborn and a sister they called difficult, the one who asked too many questions and did not bend easily to control. And because of that, I became the family disappointment long before I knew what disappointment meant. Blake could do no wrong, and he learned to wear that privilege like a badge, moving through the house with the confidence of someone who believed life would never shut a door on him, while I learned to shrink to avoid trouble, learned to carry my own pain, because no one else intended to carry it with me. When I told my family at 18 that I had decided to enlist, there was no celebration, no proud silence or emotional goodbye, only my mother shaking her head while keeping her eyes on the sink and telling me in a tone as flat as the kitchen tiles that I would come crawling back once I realized I was not built for that world, and Blake laughing from the hallway saying I would never survive boot camp because I cried too easily and got out of breath too fast and hated being yelled at. I remember standing there with my paperwork in hand, feeling the familiar pressure in my chest, the kind that made me want to defend myself, to fight for recognition. But something inside me shifted in that moment, a small spark of defiance carried by the knowledge that their voices had been wrong about me for years. And maybe this was my chance to prove it, not to them, but to myself. Basic training at Fort Jackson was the first place where I learned that my body could do more than I ever imagined, and that my mind could hold steady under pressure. And while others collapsed under the weight of expectation, I found a strange sense of clarity, a place where effort actually meant something. Later at Fort Sam Houston, I trained in medical skills, long days filled with studying trauma, practicing procedures until my hands cramped, learning how to think fast while staying calm, and little by little, I rose to the top of my class, not because I was born stronger or smarter, but because every dismissive comment from home fueled a determination I carried like quiet fire. Some nights during training, I lay awake on the narrow cot thinking of my mother's voice telling me I would not last, and Blake's smirk when he said I would quit. And those memories pushed me through every drill, every test, every mile run in the Texas heat. And by the time graduation came, no one was surprised when I was selected for a more demanding field environment. My instructors noticed I stayed composed under pressure and reacted quickly to simulated emergencies. So when the request came for a medic to attach temporarily to a ranger platoon for a training rotation, my name rose to the top, and although the rangers teased me the first day, calling me small, calling me quiet, calling me too calm, I watched their expressions change the first time a real training injury happened. A soldier twisted his leg during a nighttime movement, falling hard, his pain sharp and disorienting, and while some hesitated, I was already on the ground, assessing the injury, immobilizing the leg, coordinating transport out of the woods, with a voice steady enough to silence the skepticism around me. And in that moment, something shifted between us. It was the first time I saw respect flicker in their eyes, the kind that comes from witnessing someone handle pressure without breaking. And even though it was only training, it was enough to mark me as someone they could rely on. Word spread faster than I expected. Not loud praise, just quiet acknowledgments passed between soldiers, the kind that mattered far more than anything I had heard at home. A few months later, when the assignment list posted and I saw my name attached to a ranger unit preparing for deployment to Afghanistan, my heart hammered with a mix of fear and determination. And I knew this was the path that would define me in ways my family never imagined. I remember closing my eyes and thinking of my mother's words, her prediction that I would come crawling back, and for the first time in my life, I felt a sense of distance from that version of me she had created, as if I were stepping into a life no one had chosen for me but me. The rangers joked when they heard I was coming along, calling me the kid, asking if I needed help carrying my own pack, but beneath the humor, I sensed curiosity and something close to acceptance building slowly. They expected me to prove myself, and I was ready, carrying with me every insult, every doubt, every careless comment that had shaped my earlier years. I boarded the transport plane knowing that whatever waited in Kunar would challenge me in ways I could not yet imagine. But deep inside, I also knew one thing with absolute certainty. I was not the weak girl they had painted me to be. I was about to show the world and myself exactly what a real soldier could look like. The air in Kunar Valley in the spring of 2019 carried a sharp dryness that crept into your throat, and lungs a constant reminder that nothing about this place was gentle. And by the time our convoy rolled through the narrow mountain road, I had already learned to read the silence between the ridgelines, the way the wind shifted when something was wrong, the way seasoned rangers tensed their shoulders even when their faces stayed expressionless. We were on a routine patrol that morning, at least that was what the schedule called it, though. Nothing in Kunar ever stayed routine for long, and as our MRAPs crawled between the cliffs, I sat behind the driver listening to the radio chatter, steadying my breath the way I had practiced countless times across training fields. When the explosion hit, it did not sound like anything I had imagined. During drills, it was not a single burst or a cinematic blast, but a violent shudder that rippled through metal and bone, the kind of force that turns time into a blur for a second before sharpening every sense you have. The lead MRAP had taken the IED, lifting off the ground for a moment before slamming back down, and I heard the panic and the short breath of the private next to me as dust and shattered rock rained across our vehicle. Before anyone had to say anything, I was unstrapping my gear, my hands moving on instinct, grabbing what I needed while the rangers shouted updates into their radios, and I could feel the tremor in my legs, not from fear, but from the surge of adrenaline that always arrived before my mind caught up. When our doors flew open, the world outside was chaos dirt swirling in harsh circles, gunfire cracking from somewhere high on the ridge, and even as rounds snapped into the rocks near us, I could hear someone yelling that 2 men were trapped inside the burning MRAP. I dropped low, pressing myself against the ground, feeling the heat of the gravel through my sleeves as I crawled forward inch by inch, using the smoke as partial cover while bullets ricocheted across the metal frame. One of the doors had crumpled, trapping a soldier inside with his leg pinned at an impossible angle, and blood streamed down his pant leg in a way that told me I did not have minutes to wait. Another ranger helped pry open the door, and I reached in immediately, grabbing under the injured man's arms, ignoring the sting shooting through my shoulder as I dragged him out and pulled him toward the shallow ditch beside the road. His pulse was fading, and when I cut open the fabric, I saw the steady flow from a torn artery, dark and frighteningly fast, so I pressed my entire weight into the wound, leaning over him, shouting for gauze, shouting for the squad leader to mark our position for medevac. The second soldier was still inside, semi-conscious, coughing through the smoke, so while one ranger covered me, I slid back inside the MRAP, the metal groaning under shifting weight, the air thick with burnt fuel, and grabbed him by the collar, dragging him out, with my boots slipping on the floor, feeling shards of metal digging into my left arm as we fell out of the vehicle together. There was no time to feel the pain, no time to process the burning heat in my shoulder, where a piece of shrapnel had lodged itself, only the rhythm of compressions and commands, the world shrinking to the sound of the wounded man's breathing, and the desperate hope that he would keep holding on long enough for the helicopter to arrive. When the medevac finally came into view, the wind from the rotors whipped the dust into a storm around us, and the medic jumping out froze for a brief second when he saw the blood soaked into my uniform, not realizing most of it was not mine, and he asked if I needed help before he realized I was still performing CPR on the soldier whose heartbeat had faltered minutes earlier. I shouted vitals to him as we lifted the two men onto stretchers, and even as the pain in my shoulder pulsed like fire, I kept moving, refusing to step back until both were secured inside the helicopter. Only when the doors closed did one of the Rangers pull me away gently, his voice rough with something that was not quite fear and not quite awe, as he told me I had done everything I could. Later, when we returned to the outpost, the commander called the platoon together, and instead of the usual businesslike debrief, they stood silently watching as he read a preliminary citation, his voice echoing against the concrete walls, describing the actions of a medic who had ignored direct danger to pull her team out of a kill zone. I remember thinking my legs might give out not from shock, but from how strange it felt to hear my own name spoken with reverence after so many years of hearing it spoken with doubt. When he finished reading, every soldier in that room, from the newest private to the captain, rose to their feet and applauded in a way that vibrated through my chest, not loud or wild, but steady and full, the kind of applause born from witnessing something real. They started calling me the Angel of Kunar after that, a nickname whispered half-jokingly at first, but repeated with sincerity in the weeks that followed, because if I was on a mission with them, they believed there was a better chance they would come home. When the formal paperwork processed, I received the Purple Heart for the shrapnel injury and a Silver Star recommendation for the rescue, and even though I wore the medals with pride, I rarely talked about them because the weight of what happened felt private too heavy for casual conversation. Sometimes now, when I sit at a family table listening to Blake tell me I am no real soldier, I remember the dust in Kunar and the echo of that applause, and the contrast between those two worlds wraps around my chest like a cold hand, reminding me how little my family truly knows about the person sitting quietly before them. Coming home after Kunar felt nothing like the triumphant return people imagine when they picture soldiers stepping off planes into waiting arms. Instead, it felt like stepping into a quieter kind of battle. One fought in hallways with buzzing lights and rooms that smelled faintly of antiseptic, because the first place I went after landing in the States was the VA hospital in Cleveland, where doctors examined my shoulder and nodded with polite sympathy as they explained the limits of my recovery while trying not to comment on the fatigue in my eyes. The shrapnel wound had healed enough for me to move without obvious struggle, but deep inside the joint, a stubborn ache lingered, pulsing at night, like an old alarm that refused to turn off, and sleep rarely came easily, because every time silence settled, I found myself drifting backward into memories of dust and gunfire, hearing echoes of men calling for help, even when I knew I was thousands of miles away. Group therapy became part of my routine. I sat in a circle with other veterans who understood the language I spoke without needing to translate it into softer words, and in those rooms, I found honesty that felt heavier than anything I had carried overseas, because we shared not just the battles we survived, but the invisible ones that followed us home. My shoulder throbbed during some sessions, my fingers sometimes trembled when unexpected sounds cracked through the building. Yet every week I returned, hoping that talking would stitch together the parts of me that still felt scattered. During that time, my inbox filled with messages from former teammates and officers who had served beside me. They sent updates about the men I had helped pull from the wreckage. They told me one was learning to walk again, another had regained full use of his arm, and they wrote things like, "You saved lives, and we will never forget what you did, and you are a hero," in a way that made my throat tighten, because I did not feel like one. Not when the nights felt endless, and exhaustion weighed on me like armor I could not remove. When Veterans Day approached that year, a coordinator from a local event reached out asking if I would speak during their ceremony in Cleveland. And although standing on a stage made my stomach twist, I agreed because it felt meaningful to honor the people who had carried me through the darkest moments. The speech was simple, steady, focused, not on medals or recognition, but on the shared strength of those who served. And when the audience rose to their feet, I felt a warmth spread through me that eased the ache in my shoulder for a moment, a reminder that someone somewhere understood the cost of what I had given. After the ceremony, the organizer sent me a recording of the event and encouraged me to share it with friends and family. So later that night, I sent the link to my mother and to Blake, hoping maybe they would watch it and finally see beyond the outdated image they clung to, hoping they could acknowledge even a fraction of what I had been through. I waited the rest of the evening with my phone nearby, glancing at the screen, every so often expecting a message, a question, some acknowledgement, but nothing came. No buzzing alert, no words of support. When I opened the chat the next morning, I saw only a single check mark on the message thread, the quiet sting of a seen notification hovering beneath it. And in that tiny symbol was an entire story about what I meant to them. There was no curiosity, no pride, no attempt to understand, just passive dismissal, wrapped in silence. Blake eventually sent something hours later, a short message so blunt it felt like a slap across the face. Stop making everything about you, he typed, as though speaking at a Veterans Day ceremony was some act of attention-seeking rather than a moment of healing. That sentence floated in my mind longer than I wanted it to, twisting itself around memories of how he had always belittled any accomplishment that did not belong to him. And for a moment, I wondered if he genuinely believed what he said, or if it was easier for him to pretend my service meant nothing than to confront the fact that he had never accomplished anything half as difficult. Outside the hospital, the world viewed me one way as someone who had faced danger with courage, someone who had acted with compassion in chaos, but inside my own family, I was still the girl they dismissed, the one who cried too much, the one who left home only to return empty-handed in their eyes. People in Cleveland recognized me from the event. Strangers approached me at grocery stores, thanking me for my service. One elderly man pressed my hand and said his grandson would still be alive today if he had had a medic like me. And though his words made my chest tighten with humility, they also made the contrast with my family painfully clear. The more others saw me as someone strong, the more my family doubled down on their belief that I was exaggerating, that I was dramatic, that I was trying to make myself important. And each time they brushed off another detail of my experience, I felt a deeper line of separation forming between us, a widening gap shaped by disbelief and disrespect. The twist of it all settled in slowly, the realization that in the eyes of the world, I was a hero, with a record of service that spoke for itself. Yet in the eyes of the people who should have known me best, I was still a disappointment. Still the girl who would never measure up to their expectations, and that contradiction pressed against me like a weight I carried long after leaving the battlefield. Returning to Akron for Thanksgiving in 2023 felt like stepping into a familiar fog, a fog I had spent years trying to escape. Yet as the holiday drew closer, something inside me whispered that maybe things would be different this time. Maybe after everything I had survived and everything that had changed in my life, my family might see me with clearer eyes. So when my mother sent a short message asking me to come early to help with the cooking, I let myself believe for a moment that it was a gesture of warmth, a sign that she wanted me there, not just needed another pair of hands. The drive from Cleveland to Akron was quiet and steady, trees stripped bare by late November winds, lining the road like thin shadows. And as I approached my childhood home, the familiarity pressed against me. The two-story structure with peeling paint still standing the way it always had, the narrow porch, the small kitchen window fogged from the heat inside, and the muffled sound of a football game drifting through the cracked door. When I stepped in, The smell of roasting turkey and spices wrapped around me warm and heavy, and for a fleeting second, I let myself imagine this day becoming something softer than the ones before. That illusion broke almost immediately. My mother barely said hello before pointing me toward a stack of grocery bags in the hallway, telling me to start unloading them because she was already behind schedule. And my stepmother appeared moments later, thrusting a dish towel into my hand and listing off everything that needed doing, the table that had to be set, the sweet potatoes that had to be mashed, the pies that needed checking in the oven. And despite the lingering ache in my shoulder, I found myself moving through the kitchen performing tasks without question, because old habits cling stubbornly. They did not ask how I was doing or how my recovery had been, or whether sleeping had gotten easier. They simply placed me into the same role I had always filled, the quiet helper in the background, the one who kept things running while others enjoyed themselves. Blake arrived nearly an hour late, pushing the door open with a grin, as though he were the guest of honor, carrying nothing but a six-pack of beer, and everyone in the living room reacted to him the way they always did, cheering his arrival, asking him about his new job and salary and promotions, showering him with attention as if he were the center of gravity in the household. He shrugged off his coat and wandered through the rooms without offering to help, sipping his beer, retelling stories about coworkers and weekend plans, while I carried trays, checked timers, and cleaned spills that no one else bothered to notice. Each time I brushed past the living room, I heard my name mentioned only in passing, sometimes as a joke, sometimes as an afterthought, but always with a familiar dismissal that made the muscles along my spine tighten. I kept reminding myself to breathe, to stay steady, to not let their indifference sink into me. Yet the more I moved around that kitchen, the more invisible I felt, as though I had slipped back into the version of myself they had crafted, long before I ever discovered who I really was. At one point, my stepmother asked Blake if he could help carry the heavy roasting pan, and he simply laughed, gesturing toward me with his beer, saying, "Kara has it, she is stronger than she looks," and even though the comment was meant to be light, it landed with a strange weight because he had no idea how painfully true that sentence was. As the afternoon settled into early evening, the house filled with relatives, the noise rising in waves, the television blaring football commentary while cousins joked in the hallway. And through it all, I kept moving from stove to sink to countertop, placing dishes onto the table while Blake leaned against the fridge, telling an animated story that made everyone in the room laugh loud and long. I felt myself drifting farther from the warmth I had hoped to find, caught in a loop of work and expectation. My name called only when something needed doing, my presence acknowledged only when convenient. At one point, I stepped into the small pantry to catch my breath, wiping flour from my hands, and that was when I heard his voice through the crack in the door. Blake was leaning against the counter talking to a cousin visiting from out of town, his tone casual, dismissive, carrying that same lazy confidence he used whenever speaking about me. "She likes to tell people she is some kind of hero," he said, and I felt my stomach drop even before he continued. "Do not buy it, most of what she says is exaggerated." There was a chuckle from the cousin, a quiet, "Oh, really?" And Blake kept going, lowering his voice enough to make the words sting sharper, saying things like, "She barely did anything overseas. She just likes the attention it gets her. I swear she tells different versions of her stories, depending on who she is trying to impress." I stood completely still, feeling heat creeping up my neck, not from anger alone, but from the raw, familiar sting of being reduced to nothing by someone who had never witnessed a single moment of what I had endured. The pantry walls around me felt too tight, the air too warm, and for a moment I closed my eyes and pictured the mountains of Kunar, the harsh wind, the weight of bodies in my arms, the thunder of gunfire, all the moments that had tested me in ways Blake could never imagine, and hearing him tear down my truth with such casual ease made something cold settle inside my chest. In that small pantry surrounded by canned vegetables and old baking pans, I realized that nothing had changed, not really, and that I had walked into the same trap I had always walked into, believing for a moment that hope could dissolve a lifetime of dismissal. Dinner began the way it always did in that house, with everyone shuffling toward the long wooden table that had been in the family for decades, its surface covered with dishes I had spent most of the afternoon preparing. And as people searched for their seats, my mother pointed me toward the corner chair near the wall, the one that wobbled slightly on uneven legs, telling me to sit there so Blake and his wife could take the center spots where everyone could see them. And even though a small part of me tightened at the familiar dynamic, I simply nodded and took my place. The noise of plates clattering and silverware scraping filled the room while football commentary drifted from the living room, and I sat quietly waiting for the conversations to settle, hoping the evening might glide by without becoming another battlefield of snide remarks and subtle jabs. Those hopes faded quickly when one of my aunts leaned across the table with a polite smile that did not match the edge in her voice and asked if I was done playing soldier now, as if the years I spent in uniform were some kind of hobby I had grown bored of, and her question hung in the air long enough for others to chuckle before she returned to her wine glass. I opened my mouth to answer, but Blake cut in, effortlessly, as though he had been waiting for the moment all day, his tone light but sharp enough to slice straight through me as he said, "You are no real soldier, Kara. You barely did anything over there." And the room responded with a mix of laughter and sympathetic nods, the kind given to the person who delivers the punchline everyone agrees with. I felt the heat rise in my chest, but kept my expression steady, reminding myself to breathe, yet the barrage continued before I could even think of a reply. Someone down the table chimed in with medics, "Just hand out Band-Aids, right, Kara?" And another voice followed, "I thought you just sat behind a desk most of the time." And someone else gave a short laugh saying, "I bet you never even heard a real gunshot," which made Blake lean back proudly as though he had orchestrated the entire scene. Their words layered over one another like falling debris, each comment landing, before I had a chance to brush off the last, and even though I had stood under gunfire in Kunar without blinking, I felt a different kind of pressure swell in my throat, the kind that comes from being surrounded, not by enemies, but by people who claim to love you while cutting you down piece by piece. At one point, a cousin tilted her head and asked in a faux curious tone, "So, what exactly did you do over there, Kara?" And when I finally lifted my eyes and began to explain, even gently, she waved her hand dismissively and turned immediately to Blake, asking him about his fantasy football standings, making it clear she had never intended to hear my answer at all. The table erupted in new conversation around her, leaving my words suspended in my mouth like an unfinished thought, and I sat there realizing how easily they erased me, how practiced they were at pretending my experiences were exaggerated stories, rather than the truth carved into my bones. When I grew quiet, someone accused me of being too sensitive. Another said I should lighten up because it was just family joking around, and Blake smirked into his drink as if he had achieved some small victory by reducing me to silence. Their laughter blended with the clinking of glasses, forming a dull roar beneath my ribs, and as I watched them interact with the easy confidence of people who had never been truly challenged, I felt a cold clarity settle over me, stronger and steadier than the sting of any insult they had thrown my way. If you have ever been talked over by family or had your hard work erased in front of strangers, then you know exactly how heavy that moment felt. And if that is you comment, I hear you, because no one should have to swallow their own truth just to keep the room comfortable. I felt the tension along my spine ease as I let the noise around me blur into background static, because in that moment something inside me shifted in a way none of them noticed. A quiet click of resolve settling into place, not the urge to fight back with raised voices or explanations. They would only twist, but a calm, decisive understanding that the best way to answer their cruelty was not through argument, but through revelation. I lifted my gaze slightly, catching glimpses of their faces, etched with amusement and ignorance, and instead of anger washing over me, I felt a faint smile form at the corner of my lips, small enough to go unnoticed, yet sharp enough to mark the beginning of something they would never see coming. I decided right then that I would not waste a breath trying to correct them or defend myself, because the truth was already on its way, and when it arrived, it would not require a single word from my mouth to dismantle every false assumption they had built about me. So I sat quietly in that crooked chair, letting their laughter roll past me like distant thunder, holding my silence, not as defeat, but as preparation, already planning the moment that would turn their mockery into stunned disbelief. And in that silence, I found my footing steady and controlled, ready for everything that would come next. I left that dinner table with the same calm expression I had worn through every insult, yet inside, something was shifting, a quiet, rising heat that did not explode, but instead crystallized into clarity as I walked down the hallway toward the small guest room where I had dropped my coat earlier. And while the noise of the family drifted behind me, I felt the strange comfort of distance settling over my shoulders, reminding me that the version of Kara they chose to see at that table was nothing more than a shadow of my real life, a life I had built far from their mockery. When I closed the door behind me, the room fell silent except for the faint hum of the old house heating system, and I let myself breathe for the first time that day, knowing that outside that door they were laughing and clinking glasses, completely unaware of who I truly was outside their narrow world. Because when I was not sitting at their table, swallowing their contempt, I was Staff Sergeant Kara Hale, a name that carried weight in circles they could never imagine, a name that was spoken on stages and in auditoriums where veterans and service members gathered to honor courage, sacrifice, and resilience. And in those spaces, I was not the quiet girl at the corner chair, but a guest speaker, invited to share what it meant to hold the life of a wounded soldier in your hands while rounds cracked through the air above you. I had spoken at events across Ohio and Pennsylvania, sometimes in front of a crowd of 100, sometimes in front of 1,000, and every time people shook my hand afterward with tears in their eyes, saying I reminded them of their daughters or sisters or someone they had lost, and their gratitude felt heavier and more real than anything I had ever received from my own blood. Outside my family circle, I had carved out an entire community, one that saw me clearly and held me up without demanding I shrink myself. And part of that community lived in a private online group filled with more than 120,000 female veterans from every branch of service. Women who understood the loneliness and weight of military life and who called me a beacon because I shared openly about fear, about blood, about survival, showing them that courage was not the absence of fear, but the refusal to let it silence you. I became a kind of older sister in that space, even though I was only 27, answering messages from women trying to leave abusive relationships, or fighting through nightmares, or struggling with the feeling that their service had left them broken. And I partnered with a nonprofit that helped female veterans rebuild their lives after domestic violence or trauma, guiding them through medical appointments, legal steps, and nights when they just needed someone to talk to until the sun came up. And in those moments, I felt my purpose more deeply than anywhere else. The truth was that my story had already reached far beyond anything my family knew, especially after the Angel of Kunar clip resurfaced and spread through the veteran community again, a grainy piece of footage taken by a helmet camera showing me dragging 2 wounded soldiers out of the wreckage while shouting instructions that kept the rest of the squad alive. And when a popular veteran podcast mentioned me in an episode about combat medics who had made impossible saves, my inbox filled with messages from people saying they had served in the same region or had lost someone there and wished they could thank whoever had been their medic. Through all of this, I kept my worlds separate, maintaining 2 completely different profiles, a quiet family. Facebook filled with old photos and occasional birthday messages, and another private profile known only in military circles, where my voice held respect, and I never linked the 2, because I knew my family would either trivialize my accomplishments or try to twist them into something that made them look better. They never understood boundaries, so I built my own. As I sat on the edge of the bed, letting my shoulders loosen, I heard my phone vibrate in my pocket, and when I pulled it out, I saw a name that immediately straightened my spine. It was my former platoon leader, who had since moved into a public affairs role for the State Guard, and his message read, "We are putting together a short video about you for this year's Veterans segment on local TV airs Thanksgiving night," which made my pulse quicken as I read it again. More slowly, realizing that the broadcast would be happening in just a few hours, while my entire family sat in the living room pretending to know what military service even meant. I stared at the screen, my heart beating in a steady, controlled rhythm, not from fear, but from a kind of anticipation that tasted almost electric, because suddenly the pieces were aligning on their own, and the universe was offering me a moment I never would have engineered myself, but one that fit perfectly into the quiet plan forming at the back of my mind. A Thanksgiving night broadcast featuring a segment about the Angel of Kunar would play in homes across Ohio and the surrounding regions, and if I chose to put the television on at the right time, my family, the same people who had just called me a fake soldier, would be confronted with the truth in a way none of them could talk over or laugh away. I exhaled slowly, letting the timing settle into place as naturally as if it had been waiting for me all along, and I whispered to myself, without bitterness, only certainty. Well, then maybe this is part of the game, a piece of the story they were never supposed to control, and with that thought, I slipped my phone back into my pocket and walked out of the room, ready for the next move. When I stepped back into the living room, the energy had shifted into that loud, chaotic haze that always followed a holiday meal. In this house, the game was on the television, and the men were slouched in their usual spots with beer bottles resting on their knees, while the women picked at leftovers in the kitchen doorway, and I moved quietly to the side of the room, knowing that none of them would notice the way my eyes scanned every detail as if I were assessing a new environment on patrol, because years in uniform had trained me to read a room long before anyone realized I was watching. Blake was already in the center of attention, talking loudly with two uncles and a cousin, leaning back as if his chair was a throne, and as I passed behind him, I heard him say with a laugh that he almost joined the army once, but was too smart to let himself get tricked into it, and the men around him burst out laughing like it was the cleverest thing they had heard all night, and even after everything at the dinner table, that line still managed to hit some deep place inside me that had grown tired of pretending that their ignorance did not sting. I sat down on the far end of the couch, calm, steady, letting their noise wash over me like wind against a bunker wall, while I pulled out my phone and opened the private profile I used only for my military community, then lifted the camera and snapped a single photo of the dining table still cluttered with empty glasses and half-eaten food, because it perfectly captured the energy of that room, messy, careless, and oblivious, and I wrote a caption beneath it that said, "Funny how some people say you are no real soldier while you have a Purple Heart in your pocket." I posted it to close friends only, and almost immediately the notifications started rolling in hearts, thumbs up, fire emojis, comments from rangers and medics, and even a lieutenant who wrote, "Tell me when and where I will gladly come educate them." And another message popped up from an infantryman saying, "Mom, you carried 2 grown men out of a kill zone. Anyone talking down to you is out of their mind," and the flood of support made something warm settle in my chest. Not pride exactly, but a whispered reminder that the truth did exist somewhere, even if it was not allowed inside this house. Then another notification appeared from a friend who worked at the local news station, a woman named Elise, who'd done interviews with my unit before, and her message read, "Wait, are you in Akron? Right now, our veteran segment about you airs in 20 minutes, and for a moment I just stared at the text, feeling the timing click into place, like the bolt of a weapon sliding forward, realizing that the first trap had already began to spring without me even having to move a muscle. I slipped the phone into my pocket, pushed myself up from the couch, and crossed the room where Blake was now telling someone that medics are basically fancy first aid kits with legs, and before the irritation had a chance to harden, I reached for the remote and said in the same steady tone I had used on patrol when asking a squad to shift formation, "Could we switch to Channel X? For a moment, there is a veterans piece on tonight," and the room let out a mix of groans and sighs, because football was the only sacred thing in this house. But my mother finally said, "Fine." Put it on quickly, then switch it back, and I nodded as if I were complying, even though inside I could already feel the tension beginning to tighten around the edges of the room. The channel changed, and commercials were playing, and no one paid attention. At first, they sipped their drinks and kept their conversations going, even as I stood there quietly watching the countdown in my head. And then the next segment began with a clear, steady narrator voice saying, "Tonight, we honor a medic whose bravery in Kunar Valley saved multiple American lives, and the room shifted so fast it felt as if gravity had tilted, because everyone fell silent at once." The screen showed drone footage of the valley, then cut to my platoon leader, speaking directly into the camera, describing how one of their youngest combat medics crawled through enemy fire to pull 2 wounded soldiers to safety. Then it cut to helmet cam footage, the same grainy clip that had been shared so many times in the veteran community, showing me moving through dust and smoke with my hands pressed to a soldier's chest. And my family stared with their mouths open as if they were seeing a ghost or a stranger who somehow shared my face. The segment continued with interviews from several soldiers who called me the Angel of Kunar and said, "If she is with you, there is hope." And the narrator explained how I had received the Purple Heart and a nomination for the Silver Star. And I watched as the entire room froze under the weight of those words, even the football game forgotten now, as if the television had turned into a window, revealing a version of me they never imagined existed. Blake was the last person to look at me, his face pale and stiff, his hand still wrapped around his beer, but no longer lifting it. And when his eyes finally met mine, I saw confusion, then disbelief, then something that looked uncomfortably close to fear, because in that moment he realized that every lie he had told, every joke he had made, every dismissive laugh meant nothing in the face of what he was seeing on the screen. I said nothing, because silence was the sharpest blade I had left, and as the segment ended with my photo and uniform standing at attention under the American flag, the room stayed completely still, a stunned quiet settling over them like dust after an explosion, and I let them sit in it, because this was the first trap, the soft revenge, the small reminder that truth does not need permission to reveal itself. The segment did not end quietly. It faded out with a slow pan across the ceremony, where I stood in uniform under the sharp afternoon sun of Fort Drum. My shoulders squared and my expression calm as the citation for the Purple Heart was read aloud, and the living room in Akron absorbed every syllable with a silence so complete it felt physical, as if the air itself had thickened around us. The voice on the television spoke my name with formal gravity. Staff Sergeant Kara Hale wounded in action while rendering life-saving aid to multiple soldiers during an ambush in Kunar Valley, and the clip showed the moment the medal was pinned to my chest, the frame catching the flicker of sunlight on the deep purple ribbon. And in that second, the difference between who I truly was and who this family had chosen to believe I was became too large for any of them to deny. No one breathed, not even the uncles who never stopped talking, not even my mother who always had something to say, and the only sound in the entire room was the gentle hum of the furnace pushing warm air through old vents. Blake stared at the screen as if he were witnessing something impossible. His mouth parted, his eyes wide and unsettled, and when the segment finally cut back to commercial, he managed to force out a thin, broken question that barely held itself together. "Is that really you?" And the way he asked it told me he already knew the answer, but his ego was clawing for a foothold that no longer existed. I did not answer him because the truth was sitting right there in front of him on a glowing television screen, and I refused to make this easier for him by filling the silence he had earned. So instead, I stood up, slowly letting the movement slice through the tension in the room and walk toward the small guest room again without saying a word, each step deliberate, measured, almost ceremonial. When I pushed open the door, the quiet wrapped around me again, and I reached into the side pocket of my bag where the wooden box rested with its familiar weight, and I paused for just a moment with my hand on the lid, remembering the day it had been handed to me, remembering the heat, the dust, the shrapnel. The trembling hands I had pressed against an open artery, and I carried that memory with me as I walked back into the living room. Everyone was still staring at the screen as if afraid to look away in case the truth changed, when they blinked, and Blake was frozen in the same spot, gripping his beer like it was an anchor. So when I stepped into their line of vision holding the wooden box, no one moved except to shift their eyes toward me, following the slow arc of my walk across the carpet. I stopped directly in front of Blake, not touching him, not raising my voice, not demanding acknowledgement, and I set the box on the coffee table with a soft click right between the television remote and the half-empty bowl of pretzels, then lifted the lid with a steady hand, revealing the purple heart, resting inside on its dark velvet lining. The metal caught the warm living room light just enough to spark a faint purple glow against the grain of the wooden table, and I watched Blake's eyes lock onto it with a look that hovered somewhere between disbelief and a sinking dread, and only then did I speak in a voice so calm it cut straight through the room. You wanted to know what a real soldier looks like. Take a good look. My mother let out a choked sound behind me, a mixture of shame and panic rather than pride covering her mouth with trembling fingers as her eyes filled with tears because she suddenly realized what she had dismissed for years without a second thought. And the stepmother who had spent the evening ordering me around dropped her gaze to the floor before whispering, "Why did you not tell us?" in a shaky voice that tried to disguise its guilt behind confusion. I shifted my eyes to her without softening my expression and said, "I did, you just never listened." And the truth of those words landed so hard that even my uncles looked away as if unable to bear the weight of what had unfolded in their own living room. The silence that followed was different from the earlier shock. It was heavier, filled with the awareness that everything they had said, everything they had implied, everything they had mocked, now existed in direct contrast with the physical symbol of sacrifice resting inches from Blake's shaking hands, and not one of them seemed to know how to breathe around that realization. But I did not leave, not yet, because this was not the kind of moment you walk away from. This was the moment you let them sit, in the moment you allow them to feel the full sting of their own smallness without the mercy of distraction. And I lowered myself onto the arm of the couch and simply watched them, my presence quiet but undeniable as their eyes shifted between the television that had exposed them and the metal that proved everything they had denied. Blake swallowed hard, his throat bobbing with effort, and his face turned red, then pale, then red again, as if shame was fighting its way through him, and he kept trying to form words, but nothing came out because anything he could say would be swallowed whole by the reality in front of him. My mother finally wiped her eyes and turned her head away from me, unable to look at the daughter she had belittled for years, now that the truth had forced its way into her home in a broadcast she could not stop. And in her silence, I recognized something I had never seen before. Not pride, not affection, but fear. The fear of being seen for who she really was by the one person she never expected to rise beyond her control. I let the moment stretch, letting them drown in it, letting the truth settle into the walls of the house that had always tried to shrink me, and I felt something inside me lift as I watched them crumble under the weight of their own reflections, because this was revenge in its most precise form, not loud, not cruel, but clear and undeniable. and as they sat there suffocating in their own shame, I finally understood the power of simply letting people face the truth they had always refused to see. The days that followed felt strangely quiet inside the house, yet loud everywhere else, because once the segment aired, it did not stay contained within the four walls of my mother's living room. It spread the way news always spreads, in small Midwestern towns, carried first by someone who recognized my name, then by someone who knew my mother, then by someone who attended church with Blake, or worked with my stepmother, or lived 2 houses down, and before long, the video clip landed on the local community page where neighbors who barely remembered my childhood began sharing it with comments like, "Did you know Kara is a decorated war hero? And her family must be so proud," and suddenly the same people who had dismissed my uniform, my service. My scars began crafting a new story about me, one where they pretended they had always known who I was and had been cheering for me the entire time. I saw it happen in real time because my mother started reposting those comments with forced enthusiasm, writing things like "our brave girl," and we always knew she had greatness in her, and the hypocrisy of it hit me like cold water. Yet I did not respond and I did not correct her, because the world would expose the truth on its own without my help, and Blake did the same thing, pretending to support me online, even though he could not look me in the eye in the kitchen when we crossed paths, his face tight with discomfort, as if he were living in a body too small for the shame swelling inside him. Offline, their behavior did not match the digital pride they flaunted, because my mother walked past me in the hallway as if the air between us had grown too heavy, and she could not hold my gaze without remembering the room full of people who had watched her freeze during the broadcast, and Blake avoided me entirely, slipping out of the house early in the morning, claiming errands or gym or work, when really he simply did not know how to exist in the same space as the sister he had spent years belittling, only to discover that she had lived a life far beyond anything he had imagined for himself. I might have let the whole situation fade quietly, if not for the fact that Blake could never fully swallow humility. It stuck in his throat like a bone. So after a day of smothered tension and forced silence, he posted a passive status on his social media saying, "Not all medals mean what you think they mean. Some people just get lucky." And the moment I saw it, my breath left my lungs in a slow, incredulous exhale, because he still could not help himself even after being confronted with undeniable proof. He still needed to find a way to rewrite the narrative so he would not have to face what he had done. I did not comment. I did not message him. I did not waste a single breath trying to explain the weight of that medal to someone who had never once carried the responsibility of another person's life in his hands. And I assumed the world would leave the matter alone, but sometimes karma travels through unlikely routes. And on the 3rd morning, I received a message from a former teammate named Hart, who had transitioned out of the Army and now worked in human resources for a private security company that hired many veterans. The message read, "Hey, saw a weird comment from someone named Blake Hale. Is he related to you because he is applying for a position here? And I want to make sure I understand the situation before I move forward." And I felt my eyebrows lift slightly at the coincidence, because I had heard Blake talking recently about applying for a job that paid well and had good benefits, and how he felt confident because companies loved military-adjacent families, and it struck me as both ironic and predictable that he would try to leverage my service even after mocking it. Hart's next message asked, "Should we know anything about your brother?" And he added that the position required a detailed background check, and their company liked to maintain strong military-friendly branding. And I sat for a long moment debating how to respond, because I did not want to trash my brother or engage in personal revenge disguised as advice. Yet I also believed in the integrity of the work Hart did and the veterans his company protected, and Blake had made himself relevant to their screening process by speaking publicly about me. So I took a screenshot of Blake's comment saying, "You are no real soldier," and the second one about medals not meaning much, and I sent them to Hart without any explanation because the screenshot said more than I ever could, and then I attached the link to the televised segment and wrote only this. These two things may help you understand the dynamic. Hart replied within minutes with a simple message understood. Appreciate the clarity, and I thought that would be the end of it. Just another small ripple in a long chain of consequences that Blake had created for himself. And I moved on with my day, not giving it more thought. 2 days later, Hart reached out again, saying background check did not go well. He will be notified he is not being moved forward. And for a second, I felt a pang of something that might have been pity, if not for the memory of Blake laughing at the dinner table while calling me a fake soldier. And the pity evaporated quickly, leaving behind only the clear recognition that people who refused to take responsibility for their behavior often collided with the truth sooner or later. Blake did not know why he failed the screening, not at first anyway, and I kept that information to myself. Because this was not revenge meant to humiliate him publicly. This was the universe handing him a mirror. He refused to look into a quiet, forced accountability that echoed the quiet cruelty he had shown me for years. And while he stomped around the house muttering about unfair hiring practices and companies not appreciating his intelligence, I sat in calm stillness, knowing that the world had begun correcting him in ways my words never could. The fallout settled into the house like a heavy winter fog, lingering in corners long after the initial shock faded. And just when I thought the silence had finally become their permanent language, my phone lit up with my mother's name, flashing across the screen, something that almost never happened unless she needed something. And when I answered, her voice came through softer than I had ever heard it, almost careful, as if selecting each word with tweezers. She said, "Kara, honey, the church is holding a small recognition service this Sunday for local veterans, and it would mean a lot if you came with us." She paused, then added, "It would look good for the family for everyone to see us together. You know how people talk," and I stood there in the kitchen listening to her twist the idea of honor into something decorative, something to display like a wreath on a front door, and I felt the quiet realization settle inside me that she still did not understand what service meant. She just wanted to borrow something shiny now that the neighborhood had discovered it existed. I let her talk. I let her explain how it would make us look united and respectable, how it would help her reputation at church, because people had been asking about me all week, and beneath every word I heard the old familiar thread of expectation that I would play the role she needed, no matter what it cost me, just as she had expected all my life. When she finally stopped, I said in a calm, even tone, "Mom, you want to use me for a photo, not to understand me." And her breath caught as if the truth had surprised her, even though it should not have, and she stammered something about families putting aside differences, but I ended the call before she could reshape the narrative into something sweeter. I thought that would be the end of it, but later that afternoon, while I was walking to my car after finishing errands, my phone buzzed again, and this time it was Blake, a message lighting up the screen with the false casualness of someone trying to mask desperation. He wrote, "Look, maybe we got off on the wrong foot the other day," and I exhaled sharply at the absurdity, because there was no wrong foot. There was only his foot stepping on my neck for years. But the message continued saying, "It would mean a lot if you could mention me when people talk to you about the Army, like just tell them we are close or something." And I stopped walking because the audacity of the request was so stunning that my body needed a moment to process it. He wanted proximity to my story, not because he respected it, but because he saw value in it, now that other people saw it too, and he wanted credit by association, as if standing next to me in a picture or hearing his name mentioned in a conversation could somehow elevate him in the eyes of coworkers or friends or the church community. And it hit me like a cold realization that nothing he said or did after the broadcast was rooted in remorse. It was rooted in hunger for the spotlight he thought I had stolen from him by existing as someone the world finally noticed. I reread the message twice, noting the absence of apology, the absence of self-reflection, the absence of anything that acknowledged what he had said to me at that dinner table. And instead, I saw only the familiar entitlement that had shaped our childhood, the belief that I owed him something simply because he wanted it. I typed back slowly, each word deliberate, "You do not get to share a story you never believed." And before I hit send, I felt a calm certainty settle into my chest, because the truth of that sentence was so absolute that it steadied my heartbeat. But even that did not feel like the ending, not with someone like Blake, someone who rewrote memories in real time to protect his pride, and I knew that words alone would not carve the boundary he needed to face. So I opened my phone's voice message history and scrolled until I found the recording he had sent a week earlier, a recording of him drunk on Thanksgiving morning, complaining to a friend where he said loud and clear, "She is no real soldier. She barely did anything over there." The same voice that had spoken those words into his phone now broadcast back into his own ears would be a mirror he could not escape. I attached the file and typed, "This is who you chose to be." You live with that, then pressed, send without hesitation, without anger, without the slightest tremor, because it was not revenge for the sake of cruelty. It was accountability delivered in the only language he understood. For a long moment, my phone stayed silent, no dots indicating a reply, no call coming through, only the quiet winter air around me settling as if the world itself was agreeing with my choice, and I slipped the phone back into my pocket, knowing that something irreversible had just taken place, not between siblings, but between two adults who finally had to stand on the truths they had created. When I drove home that evening, the sky was heavy with clouds reflecting the dull orange of streetlights, and I felt a lightness inside me that had nothing to do with victory and everything to do with release. Because for the first time in years, I was not shrinking to make room for their comfort. I was not softening myself to avoid confrontation. I was not being the version of Kara they required in order to feel bigger. I was simply being who I had always been, and letting them decide whether they could live with their own reflections. They wanted sympathy, they wanted image repair, they wanted access to a story they had mocked for years, but what they truly needed was distance. The kind that forces people to hear their own voices echo back at them until they understand exactly what they became. And as I pulled into the driveway, I knew this was only the first part of the reckoning, the beginning of a shift that would shake every relationship in that house, because the truth was no longer a secret, living quietly inside my chest. It was a broadcast played across the county, and they could no longer pretend not to hear it. The week after I sent Blake the voice note felt strangely calm, almost deceptively so, like the quiet after a heavy snowfall when everything looks soft on the surface, but the cold underneath can split the ground open, and during that time I kept to myself and focused on work while the household pretended to function normally, even though the air between us had shifted into something brittle. It did not take long before the next ripple hit, because consequences rarely arrive gently. And one evening, as I was making tea in the kitchen, my mother walked in with the purposeful stiffness she always adopted when she needed something from me, her hands clasped together as if rehearsing niceness. She cleared her throat and said, "Kara, I need to talk to you about something important." And without waiting for a response, she launched into an explanation that Blake and his wife had found a small house they wanted to buy a fixer-upper out near the edge of town, and they needed help getting approved because Blake's credit history was not strong enough to secure a loan on his own. She said it as though the problem had materialized out of thin air rather than being shaped by his choices. Then she added the line she thought would tug at my sense of duty. "You should help your brother. He needs stability. He will have a family someday, and you know how hard it is to get started." I stirred my tea slowly, letting the spoon circle the mug while she talked, letting her fill the air with manipulative sweetness that always made her voice sound like sugar, clinging to something rotten beneath it. And when she finished, she looked at me with that expectant gaze that assumed I would bend the way I always had before I left for the army. I set the spoon down with a soft clink and said calmly, "I am not signing anything for him." Mom, and the shock that crossed her face, would have been almost comical if it were not so revealing, because she truly expected that my service, my achievements, my independence still existed solely to be used for the benefit of her favorite child. She sputtered something about family and responsibility, but I shook my head and said banks and security clearance policies do not mix. I cannot attach my name to someone's financial risk. And she froze because the explanation sounded professional enough to be unquestionable, yet she still tried to push, insisting that Blake needed a chance and that it would not hurt me to help. I took a slow sip of tea, then added the line that had been waiting in the back of my throat, the one shaped by years of being dismissed. I do not put my name next to someone I cannot trust under fire or in a bank. And the moment the words left my mouth, I felt the quiet sting of truth settle in the room like dust. My mother's expression twisted with offense, as if my refusal were cruelty rather than self-preservation. And before she could gather herself, Blake stormed in from the hallway because apparently she had already alerted him that I had refused. He looked red-faced and frantic the way people look when the world stops bending for them, and he slammed his hand on the counter hard enough to rattle a jar of utensils, shouting that I was selfish and acting superior because of a piece of metal. And for a split second, I wondered if he even understood the irony of using the very metal he had mocked to accuse me of pride. I leaned against the counter, unbothered letting his tantrum unravel, because anger from people who expect obedience always looks the same: frantic, noisy, directionless. And when he finally paused for breath, I met his eyes and said, in an even tone, "You were fine when you thought I was no real soldier. Stay with that version of me." His face changed, then twisting with the realization that the image he had crafted for himself no longer worked on me, and he shouted something about betrayal and family loyalty, then stormed out of the kitchen, leaving the air vibrating in his wake. My mother shot me a wounded look and followed him as if her footsteps could contain the fallout, but the truth was already spilling into the edges of their world, because the loan officer called the next day with the predictable verdict that Blake had not been approved and that he would need a stronger co-signer to move forward. And when he came home with the news, he sent the front door slamming so hard the whole house shook. Over the next week, the unraveling accelerated in small, inevitable ways. Arguments between Blake and his wife drifted from behind closed doors, loud enough for the neighbors to hear accusations about money and responsibility. And failure bounced through the hallways, and the optimism they had wrapped around the idea of the house began to sour into bitterness that stained everything they touched. I stayed out of it because their world had been cracking long before I stepped back into it, and the weight of their resentment was simply shifting now that they could no longer anchor it to me. Each evening, I returned from work to the echoes of another fight: muffled crying in the bathroom, heated whispers in the living room, the slow, heavy crumble of a foundation built on entitlement and denial. And even though I never wished them harm, I understood that this was the natural consequence of choices made long before I refused to co-sign a loan. Blake walked around the house in a tight, miserable silence, no longer able to blame employers or circumstances, because somewhere beneath his anger, he knew the truth, even if he refused to admit it out loud, and the weight of that unspoken awareness seemed to drag at him with each passing day. Watching him fall apart did not bring me joy, but it brought a clarity that I had not felt before: the clarity of knowing that boundaries do not destroy families. Denial does, and all I had done was remove myself from the role he expected me to play, so he could finally see the results of his own actions without me cushioning the impact. The unraveling continued quietly, steadily, not explosive, but persistent. Like a slow leak in a house no one bothered to repair, and I moved through it with the calm of someone who had survived far harsher environments, knowing that this too was part of the reckoning they had summoned long before I said a single word. 1 year later, the world around me felt different, not because life had suddenly become easier, but because the noise that once surrounded me had finally fallen away, leaving space for something steady and quiet and honest to take its place. And that shift began the moment I moved into my small apartment in Cleveland, where I started my full-time work at the VA hospital, supporting female veterans and survivors of domestic violence, women whose stories mirrored pieces of my own in ways that made every day feel meaningful even when the work was heavy. I spent my mornings reviewing case files and my afternoons sitting across from women who carried invisible wounds far deeper than the ones on their skin, guiding them through housing applications, therapy appointments, and legal steps with the same calm focus I had once used on the battlefield. And in those rooms filled with soft voices and trembling hands, I felt a sense of belonging I had never felt in my childhood home, because these women saw me clearly without expectation or comparison. Over time, my work gained attention through the nonprofit I partnered with and through the circles of veterans who continued to share the Angel of Kunar story. And by mid-year, I found myself invited to speak at conferences and community gatherings where people listened with the kind of respect and sincerity my family had never been able to give. And when a national organization launched a campaign called Real Soldiers, Real Stories, they asked if I would be willing to represent the program as one of the faces of female veterans who had rebuilt their lives after service. I hesitated for a moment, not out of fear, but out of the awareness that stepping into the public eye again would draw attention back to a past I had put down gently, yet something inside me knew that telling the truth openly could help women who had never been allowed to speak their own. So I agreed, and soon after a small film crew arrived at my apartment to capture parts of my story. They filmed the medals displayed on my shelf, the Purple Heart, the handful of challenge coins, the Silver Star recommendation. They filmed the walls where I had hung pictures of my squad letters from families I had helped save, photos of women from the support groups whose courage humbled me daily, and the crew moved quietly through the space, capturing the intimate details of a life rebuilt with intention rather than approval. When the segment aired on national television, it unfolded gently and respectfully, showing my journey without dramatizing it and highlighting the women I worked with more than the medals I had earned. And viewers responded with an outpouring of messages that filled my inbox for weeks. But the one reaction I did not look for came from the house where my mother and Blake still lived. They watched that segment in the living room where they had once mocked me watching the same screen that had exposed them a year earlier. But this time, I had not told them it was coming, and I had not invited them to watch, because their access to my life was no longer a right. It was a privilege they had surrendered long ago. Later that night, my phone buzzed with a message from my mother reading, "We are proud of you now." And the word "now" struck me so sharply, I felt my jaw tighten, because pride that arrives only after public recognition is not pride at all. It is opportunism disguised as affection. And I typed back the truth she had earned. You do not get to now me. You had all the years before. Then I put my phone down and let the distance remain. A few days passed before the second message arrived, this time from Blake, written with a shaky desperation he could not hide, saying he had lost his job after his comments about veterans resurfaced, and he needed help finding work or getting a reference because people were calling him disrespectful, and he knew I had connections in the veteran community and in the security sector, and he ended the message with a plea that felt heavy with entitlement rather than remorse. I read it 3 times slowly, then replied in a tone as calm as the winter air outside the army, taught me to never leave a good soldier behind. It never said anything about saving the ones who shoot their own, and when I hit send, I felt no anger, only certainty, because boundaries are not revenge, they are clarity, and offering him help would have been the real betrayal of everything I had stood for. Months later, on a cool autumn afternoon, I visited the National Cemetery where several of my former teammates were laid to rest, and I walked slowly between the rows of white markers until I found the names that shaped my past, kneeling beside them with quiet reverence as the wind rustled the dry leaves around me. I touched the Purple Heart resting on my chest and felt the familiar weight settle into my palm, a reminder of the blood shed, the lives saved, the nights survived, and I realized in that silent space that the people who had truly understood me were not the ones I shared a roof with by birth, but the ones I shared a battlefield with by choice. Standing there beneath the wide open sky, I understood that family is not defined by obligation or resemblance, but by those who would bleed with you and for you and never doubt your worth. And I no longer needed my mother or Blake to validate a life they had never been capable of understanding. When I turned to leave, I felt a stillness inside me, not emptiness, but resolution, the kind that comes when you finally walk away from a war you never agreed to fight. And as I stepped toward the gate, I whispered a quiet thank you to the men and women whose names surrounded me, because they had given me the courage to walk forward without needing anything from the people behind me. If you have ever walked away from a family that refused to see your worth, you did not abandon them, you chose yourself. And that is not selfish. That is survival. Tell me in the comments, what did you have to walk away from?